Hi, everyone.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. It's absolutely a pleasure to be presenting. And thank you to the National Cybersecurity Alliance for having us. I'm absolutely delighted to be the one asking the questions for two brilliant guests, Maggie Gleckley and Woody Herzog. And I'm sure you've heard of both of them. So would y'all two like to say hello and introduce a little bit more about yourselves to the audience?
Sure.
Maggie?
I'm Maggie Gleckley. I'm the Associate General Counsel, Head of Global Privacy at A&E Networks. And I've been doing privacy for many years, and I've started out in the technology field. So this is a topic near and dear to me.
Absolutely. And Woody?
Hi, everybody. I'm Woody Hartog. I'm a professor of law and computer science at Northeastern University. I've been researching privacy and data protection and data security issues for a while now. And I like to say I teach computer science and technology issues to lawyers and law stuff to computer scientists at Northeastern.
Absolutely. And it's quite a challenge on both sides of it. So if y'all haven't tuned into the programs that we've had already and the speakers we've got coming up, I do encourage all the listeners to please stay tuned. We have fabulous speakers for the rest of the program with absolutely fabulous conversation coming your direction. I don't know if most everyone out there understands that why we celebrate Data Privacy Day or Data Protection Day, as most of the world says, on January 28th. So it is the celebration of the signing of Convention 108, which was the first international treaty on privacy and data protection. So Europe actually launched it, but it's celebrated in the US, Canada, Nigeria, Israel, all across Europe. And it's only on this side of the pond that we call it Data Privacy Day. But if you use the hashtag DPD, you're safe. It covers both of them. So let's dive in then. So, Woody, you have a book called Privacy's Blueprint, The Battle to Control the Design of New Technologies. In this book, you're explaining the popular digital tools that expose people and manipulate users into disclosing personal information, which, funny enough, is a big part of India's proposed data protection bill, is to avoid psychological manipulation, which I have never seen in a bill. So what steps need to be taken to change that trend then?
Thank you so much, Kay. I really appreciate it. So in my book, I talk about what I call privacy law's design gap. And the idea is that the three major laws of privacy, and I took the liberty of summing all of privacy law down to essentially three major rules. And the first, and all three of them have a hole in them where I think they're not sufficiently responsive, and they may not even able to be responsive to issues of how design affects our privacy. And design does two things, right? So design gives off signals, right? So when we go to, say, a privacy dashboard and we click on a button or something like that, it sends signals to us about how that technology works and is going to work on our lives.
Right.
Technology also makes things easier and harder, right? So it either inhibits an activity or it facilitates it one way or the other by raising essentially the cost of doing it. And I don't think that the three major rules of privacy are sufficiently responsive to that. And let me sort of build that out a little more if I can. So the first rule is really the first rule that we started with the FTC and privacy, which is do not lie, right? Section 5 of the FTC Act, which is don't engage in a deceptive trade practice. And it's been a good rule because there are lots of practices out there that are deceptive in the privacy space. And I know that we first started regulating privacy in the mid-1990s because of privacy policies. And so we said things like don't lie in your privacy policy. The problem with the do not lie rule is twofold. First, it's relatively easy to hide technical truths in privacy policy. So I asked my privacy law students, like, if you were forced to disclose the location of your buried treasure and you really didn't want to, and you had to stick it somewhere where you knew nobody would read it, where would you put it? You put it in a privacy policy or a term.
Right.
And so that doesn't really protect people if it allows companies to be sort of forthright or sort of engage in abstractions like vagaries that really sort of hides the true nature of things, even though you're technically being true. It also doesn't protect against things like manipulative language, right? That
Right.
coerces us and wheedles us through design. For example, by manipulating transaction costs. I mean, all of you sort of probably have the experience of buying something and it came with a rebate and it says, oh, it's $100, but it's only $80 after rebate, or $70. And nobody sends the rebate in.
Who sends in the rebate, right? No one.
No.
Nobody sends the rebate in. Why? Because it's a pain in the butt to do it, right? The transaction cost of doing so is high enough that it sufficiently discourages people from engaging in it. So the do not lie rule doesn't really cover that. Okay, so maybe we go to the next rule, right? The next rule is do not harm. And do not harm is, of course, largely manifested by the torts and the unfair trade practices prohibition. But that one really only covers significant harms, right? Things like severe emotional distress or dramatic exposure or significant interference with our autonomy. Which
is getting harder and harder to prove.
Exactly. Right. Thanks to TransUnion versus Ramirez, it's continually getting harder to prove. But the problem, of course, with the do not harm rule is that it doesn't cover the little things, the small little death by 1,000 cuts that gets us every time, right? Because it's those little things, the little bit of exposure here and the little bit of exposure there that cumulatively add up to a harm, but never actually register with our privacy rules. And so what happens then is that companies are able to configure their systems to extract just a little bit here, a little bit there, and a little bit there. And design then is used to harm our privacy in ways that don't register with privacy law. So the final rule, which is essentially the big one, right, which is follow the fair information practices. This is
yes.
This is the CCPA. This is the whole deal, right? This is essentially global data protection law. And the problem with the sort of fair information practices is also twofold. The first of which is it seems like the answer that a lot of regulators come up with for privacy problems is that we just must not be, fipping hard enough, right? Like if there's privacy violations, you just got to chuck some more fips on it and we'll just turn that dial up and that'll solve the problem, right? But there's a problem with that, which is the way that the fips get manifested, particularly when you start thinking about things like consent or you start thinking about things like data subject rights, is giving people control over their personal information, which sounds great in theory, right? Like, ooh, I love giving, hey, it's agency, it's autonomy respecting, who could disagree with something like that? But the problem with getting your wish when you for more privacy, when you think of privacy as control over information, is that you get so much control that you choke on it. You are given so many options, right? You're just awash in a sea that it becomes essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy that we just give up, right? We get overwhelmed, we give up in the same way that if you've ever had that feeling of sort of choice paralysis when you walk into a big department store or IKEA and you're like, oh, all these choices are available. And so design then sort of works to give people the illusion of agency, right? Oh, here's some privacy settings. You've got 200 knobs and tools and you can adjust everything to your heart's content. Which maybe we can use on one or two sites and we feel good about it. But in the aggregate, I think essentially risks people feeling like they're more protected than they already are. And so to answer your question, Kay, and I apologize for taking a while to get there. To answer your question, what do we need to change this? I think that we need to shift our focus away from individualized sort of rules that seek to give people control over information, individualized rules that give people data subject rights. What we know about data subject rights is that most people don't use them even if they have them. Why? Because it's very costly to do so. And start thinking about rules that shift the burden onto organizations, things like relational duties that are being explored right now in various legislatures, things like duties of loyalty, duties of care, and duties of confidentiality. Sometimes these are referred to as information fiduciary principles. And also start thinking about specific rules about, just like you said, making sure that user interfaces are not crafted to take advantage of our built-in resource limitations and vulnerabilities. And so if I sort of had a magic wand and could, tap it for the Federal Trade Commission, I would add on a third prong to unfair and deceptive trade practices, and I would port over a prohibition on abusive trade practices, which we find in the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's grant of authority. And so
Right.
finding those sorts of things, I think, is a meaningful way to sort of move past, I think, a lot of the same conversations we've been having about, frankly, ineffective approaches to privacy, and moving towards a more holistic, meaningful approach that doesn't demand quite as much from users.
Oh, I love it. And I love your 3 rules that you had until you got to the FIPS. I was going to say, oh, these are the rules we learned in kindergarten. Don't lie. Don't harm. Don't, I don't know, take advantage of other people. It's, I thought these were that. So before we go to Maggie, who's in the cultural, in the corporate cultural environment, in your opinion, quickly, what do corporates need to do? How do you change the culture to respect consumer privacy?
So that's a great question, and I appreciate it. I think that there are 2 things that we should focus on. One is, and this is to build off my previous comment, we have to quit asking people to do everything themselves, right?
Right.
So
I agree.
A lot of times it feels empowering to create a lot of options for users.
Yeah.
Right? It feels like, listen, we're giving you all these tools. And in an isolated standpoint, if you were the only sort of app that anyone ever interacted with, then it would be great, right? I could just set my one little dashboard for the day and I'd be set. But of course, we interact with tons of different ones. And
This
it
makes
feels
me envision that scene in Matrix where they go to get weapons and they're dropped in a room with millions and millions of weapons and they each pick up about 10.
Exactly.
That's kind of like our privacy armory, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? Like we can't bring the whole armory with us, right? So at most we can sort of make a few decisions. And so the first is to try to think of solutions that don't demand that sort of interaction from users.
Right.
And then the second one, I think, is be a little more prepared to take things off the table if they don't work. And a lot of this is a function of our general conceptualization of privacy, which is as long as we get people's consent for things and we make them aware of things, then if they're good with it, we should be okay to do it. I mean, I don't think that's true. And I think that sort of having a more responsive approach would be willing to say, listen, we're going to lose some money on this, but we just can't do it. And I know that that does happen a fair amount already, but I think sort of moving past the idea that consent and notice heals all wounds is a really important step in the right direction.
It is. It is very much so. So Maggie, then turning to you, so we're going to come to you about the culture in companies and what companies can actually do. So do you agree with Woody on that? In your work, have you seen any particular measures or programs that actually help move us in the positive direction?
I think a lot of it has to do organizationally, and what industry you work in. I mean, there are specific industries that have a lot of rules and compliance and enforcement that is required. But then we have other places where it doesn't exist. Like you're not tied to any kind of banking or insurance regulations, so it may be a little harder. But I think a lot of it is, and it sounds so cliche, but it really is about educating your employees, what they can do, what they can't do. And more importantly, it's not a compliance person or a lawyer or an operations person saying, here's the policy, now go do. It's not that simple. And
go forth and conquer.
Right, but you see it all the time. And what it's really about is when you look at it through the lens of what you want to do and how to achieve that objective, you have to put yourself in the seat of the consumer and look at it through the consumer eyes, because you know what the law wants you to do, and now you have to educate your product people and your design people. What do they have to put in place? How they're going to do data minimization, how they're going to do collection, the rights that Woody talked about. How do you build that in? Because the worst thing that could happen is the product is built and, people come to go, well, can you just say everything is good and can we go launch and off we go? No, it's not like that anymore. Things have changed drastically over the years. Like even from GDPR, we see what's happening in CCPA, we see what's happening in CPRA in Virginia and Colorado. We see all these changes that are coming. So your product people and your design people have to be educated. More importantly, for the organization as a whole, you have to educate the organization, and it comes from the top. I mean, again, sounds simple, but it's very difficult. You're changing an organizational mindset. to think of privacy. Now, from a corporate perspective, and if you have multiple shareholders, well, they're going to be concerned about share price. So it really is, if there's an event that happens that would impact brand or reputation, that's going to be devastating to an organization. But if you get in there early and you talk to your divisions or your leaders and you're talking about privacy and trying to build it into the, not only just the culture, but what you're doing, because it's about customer trust. We see so many cases that are out there, and customers feel deceived, and they feel like, well, you sold me this, but I didn't get that. And to Woody's point, it's deceptive, and they lied and there was harm. So there are many, many opportunities to do this, but you start at the top. You make sure that understanding what you're selling and what you're doing, and you build in those concepts. I can say it is not easy, and you're shifting a corporate culture and a mindset. It doesn't happen overnight, and it takes time, but you have to keep building. You can start out very basically, but you keep building those blocks and building that development. And, people will come to you and they will ask questions about, can we do this? What makes sense? So putting yourself in the customer's space, like, you leave work, we all buy stuff, we all go online, we all do subscriptions, and look at it through that lens and go, we're selling a product. How would I feel if someone delivered that to me? Would I be happy with that? And I view it that way. Put yourself in the shoes of the consumer, whether you're a designer, a product engineer, a lawyer, compliance person, operations. I think it makes a big difference to shift that focus.
It is. And I think what's critical is one of the things you said. It's about the designers, the engineers, the people designing what data the product solution is collecting or using, actually understanding why they need to do what you're asking them to do. Quite often they want to shoot the messenger, and you're just the one telling them what the law says to try to keep it right. So I think you're right. I think privacy has become almost a 4-letter word to people working in products. It's a bad thing. It's a risk thing. It's a legal thing. It's really not. It's a customer trust thing.
But I think also it's not just about the design. And to your point, it's about what happens to the organization if you get it wrong. Like, what happens if you get it wrong? There could be FTC enforcement. There could be some state enforcement. There could be fines. So it's not just about product working or engineering working as a division in an organization. It goes across the entire organization, because think about, if there's a problem, who gets involved? Your marketing team, your PR team, your legal team, the executives get on board. The board may have to be involved. So it's not, if you do one thing, it's like, to Woody's point, do no harm, because it's a ripple effect. It's a complete ripple.
And trust me,
privacy professionals,
you can't. And privacy professionals are not looking for that level of job security. We're really not. We don't need a whole bunch of enforcement activities. So how do we balance? So Maggie, I'll come to you since you started this. How do we balance privacy by design without hindering technological innovation?
I know companies want to create great products. We all do. I mean, we all love these products, these new technologies. We want to make them work, and we want to have a great customer experience. But I think at that point, it's a balance. It's like, you think about the risk shifting. You can do this, but if you don't understand the impact, it makes it very difficult. And I remember early on when there was a lot of the apps that go, well, I want access to your contacts and I want all of your photos. And there wasn't the ability to turn them off. And the question is, well, what do you need them for? You don't need that. There's nothing in your app that says that you need it. So I think it really is, when you build it and understand what it is that you need to do to have a product, but at the same time, make sure that, again, don't collect more than you need. It sounds very simple, but when you're building code, it's easy to get the code right up front than have to retrofit an entire product. But I think what's also helpful in this space, and what we see, is there's a lot of actions that are taking place at the state level. We've seen there's a lot of information coming out now from the FTC. We're looking at dark patterns. There's AI. There's all these different elements that come into play now. So it's not just build the product, but be mindful of what's happening in the landscape and think about what would happen. So I think it's not just, like I said, you build it and you live in your little vacuum, it's all encompassing now because there's so much happening and there's so much activity in this space. You need to be aware of what's happening.
Right. We grew up in technology with the mindset of collect every single bit of data out there and sift through it, and eventually a couple of gems will fall through. That shouldn't be the mindset anymore. You should focus on the gems and go looking for the valuable pieces and let people know that's what you're looking for. And maybe they'll help you find it. Maybe they'll even give you some valuable pieces. What's your take then, Woody? How do we balance? Is technical innovation still possible in a world full of privacy laws?
That's a great question, Kay. So I hear the innovation concern a lot. And I want to sort of start by maybe reframing it a little, because not all innovation is great. We've had a lot of innovation that's actually horrible, that leads to, a destroyed environment, corroding public institutions, or things that's just outright waste that creates more problems than it solves, like, IoT wine bottles and IoT baby diapers. And
I don't need an IoT baby diaper.
I know, yeah. I mean, no, nobody does, right? But here we are. And so there's I think that a lot of innovation is bad and we can do without it. So I'm fine leaving it on the table, right?
Right.
B, I think that innovation is a lot sturdier than it gets the reputation for. I don't think it's quite as fragile as we tend to talk about it. As a matter of fact, history has shown that we've been at our most wildly innovative in the face of constraints, right? So when things are constrained, that's when we start to really get creative. It also has the fortunate byproduct of sort of prioritizing things that we need, right? So if we do have sort of a limited space to operate, then we're forced to prioritize, and maybe we'll actually get more good things out of that. But what I actually like to reframe the discussion around is not innovation, which again, sometimes it also feels like innovation sort of sprinkled like magic dust, right? Like, but what about innovation, right? And I think
I love how you're sprinkling it down. When I think of it more as like a dandelion, just
exactly, just blooming, right? And so it feels almost like a talisman, like to ward off regulation, right? Like, oh, but you're going to hurt innovation. Now there is a legitimate, I think, tension there that's really important for privacy law to balance, and that is, how do we get beneficial uses of personal information, of which there are many that we can think of, right? I mean, the pandemic alone showed us the importance of things like disease surveillance, among other things, right? Or you can think of lots of reasons why you would want a beneficial use of collecting that information. But Maggie did such a great job of talking about how people are distrustful now. And so they're scared, right? So when information is asked of them, it's not just me, it's a lot of people whose first instinct is like, why do you want this information? What are you going to do with this information, right? Like, it's almost like we feel like we've got a little like PTSD or something, like because information is being extracted at us for so many different reasons that it's hard to get a handle on. We can't trust the people that some of which, maybe bound by the right rules would be incredibly trustworthy, right? And so I think that the way that we balance this is actually through recognition of one of the most ancient forms of a privacy protection, which is a relational obligation. Duties of trust, duties of confidentiality, duties of care. This exists in our everyday lives already. We trust our physician and we expose ourselves to them because we want them to do good things with the information that we give them, right? And this can be true sort of broadly, but you need those rules in place to ensure that trust, right? And this actually helps for long-term sustainable relationships, because then people feel like they can trust the organizations that are collecting their personal information, right? The only organizations that should be scared of rules of loyalty are those that plan on being disloyal, right? And using that information in ways that are corrosive, right, to people's trust. And so I think this is a way that we can sort of break out of this consent trap, because now the I agree button feels like a trap every single time we click it, right? We Nancy Kim had a great article called Clicking and Cringing, right? Where it's just like, what am I agreeing to, right? If we had meaningful, non-waivable duties of loyalty, then people wouldn't have to worry about that. People would be protected no matter what they chose. And organizations could continue to collect information that's mutually beneficial, both for the organization and for the individual, and optimally society at large. And everybody wins. And that's a beautiful thing. But only if we have better rules that ensures that people are going to be safe when they expose themselves to other people.
I like that. So we've
Love
got
that.
3 minutes. So each of you gets 1 minute each because you'll both go over. On literally very short, very true. The question we're asking everyone, what trends do you see coming?
I think we're going to see, I think we've got 21 states now that have some form of privacy law. I think it will keep coming. I don't believe we're going to get to federal privacy law. I do think that we are going to have more data localization that we'll see globally. And I think there's going to be a big focus now on your vendors, both your processors and sub-processors. If you're working with a large company, again, it goes to trust and making sure that the right relationships are in place. And I think we're going to see more big companies asking for those individual processors or sub-processors provide certifications for anything from like ISO or SOC on the security side. Data broker laws, I think we'll see more of those because there's just so much consumer data at this point. And I think we'll see more activity from the FTC on big tech and artificial intelligence. That's my run.
That's phenomenal. Wow, that was a lot. Woody?
Well, Maggie nailed it. I completely agree. Like, that's exactly, I think, what we're going to see. I agree with you. I don't have a lot of hope for federal legislation in the short term anyway, even though there may be a sort of way out of this. But so I'll just add a few things to sort of keep, playing the same tune I've played all session. I think that we will start to see legislatures exploring with relational duties now more than some way to get us out of the consents. Notice and consents and follow the FIPS sort of standard marching orders that we've been playing with now for 20 years. I think that we're going to see both legislatures and in private litigation, we'll see people focusing on dark patterns a little more.
Just like the suit filed by the state AGs yesterday.
That's exactly what I was just fixing to reference. That literally uses the language of dark patterns, which is, and of course, dark pattern prohibitions have indirectly been around for a long time, but we never called them that until now. Right. I think we'll probably see that sort of concern around manipulative user interfaces heightened. Yeah. And then the final thing I'll say is I think that the trend of municipalities, cities, and states enacting outright bans is going to increase. So we saw for the first time San Francisco, Oakland, Somerville, cities that are now enacting outright bans on things like facial recognition technologies. The city of Portland did it for places of public accommodation in addition to law enforcement. I think that's a step in the right direction about thinking about substantive laws instead of purely procedural ones, because those almost always tend to fall back on, did you do an assessment? Did you get consent? And you can justify all sorts of things under that. And so that's the direction I see it. I think if we're lucky, we'll see it head in that direction.
Beautiful. Thank you both for a wonderful program and for joining today. It has been an absolutely delight to hear your opinions and your thoughts on what's coming. And so, hosts, we turn it back over